Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Beyond Seven Figures podcast. Today's guest is a keynote speaker and chief storyteller. In fact, her talk has been on TED.com, and it was about how your brain responds to stories and why they're crucial for leaders. Now, her TED Talk has over 2 million views. It's been pretty transformational for leaders, CEOs, founders, and the like. So I felt I owed you a opportunity to introduce you to my guest, Karen Eber. Now, in her upcoming book, The Perfect Story: How to Tell Stories That Inform, Influence, and Inspire, she's able to talk about storytelling and how to create engaging and immersive experiences. And in today's environment, being able to tell that story, to capture their attention, to keep their attention, and to inspire some degree of action is critically important to not just go beyond seven figures, but to create sustainable growth. So, without further delay, Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, what was it about stories that captivated you enough that you decided that you were going to dedicate a big part of your life to sharing the impact of stories?
Like many people, I had a moment when I was younger that I felt different. So I have two different color eyes, a brown and a green eye. It was my favorite thing about myself. But as I started to get to school age and be around more people and adults, I would start to notice the moment where they would realize, and we would be in a conversation, and you see their eyes going back and forth, looking from one eye to another as if they're watching a tennis match, and the conversation would slow and it would come to a halt and they would say something like, "Did you know you have two different color eyes?" To which I would like, "No, are you kidding?" Which that's fine. It's a little unique. So it was attention grabbing. And
Wow.
the thing that I loved about myself became this burden because people were then calling me weird. And I got really tired of it. And one day I told this story about the time I was 5 years old. Well, I was coloring and I was hungry. So I dug into the box and I picked up a green crayon and I sniffed it and it didn't really smell like very much, maybe a little waxy. And I took a nibble and I liked it. And so I ate the green crayon and I ate all the green crayons in the box. And the next day I woke up and my eye was green.
Is that a true story?
And no, it's not a true story. But what I recognize in this moment is, wow, a story can really shift the energy and the interaction. And it created a whole different interaction and dialogue. It also created something memorable. I have people 30 years later telling me that they think of me when they see crayons and they remember it. And so this moment showed me this is a way to really connect with people and change an interaction and shift energy in a way that's fascinating.
Mm.
And then I had a corporate career for 20 years working in companies like GE and Deloitte as a head of culture, a chief learning officer, where I was in positions where I was trying to influence people to invest in projects or technology or learning. And very few people could say yes, but so many people could say no. I would use
Mhm.
stories, and I found that was helping influence the no sayers, the people that might say no, into saying yes and encouraging the people that could approve the budget. And I regularly used this when I was in a head of culture role. I had 90,000 employees in 150 countries. I used stories to connect with them and help them think about different ways they could shape culture or what it meant to them. And so while I had this defining moment as a
Right.
child, as I've moved through my career and into my own company, I've recognized that this is a really important communication tool to connect, to inspire, to just change thinking. And then when I did the talk that went viral on TED, I got so many questions around how are you doing this and how can I do this, that I've shifted that to be a big part of my focus to help people be more dynamic and memorable communicators.
I had a guest on a while back, Mason Bendewall, and he was a gentleman who put P90X on the map. And he said something very similar to you, which is the power of story. As he said, Charlie, look at you. Now, you're a business coach working with 7, 8, 9 figure CEOs, but you don't look like one. You got a t shirt and you got a big tattoo on your arm. So there's a story there. Tell me about the tattoo. And when I told him about the tattoo, he was like, see, magnificent. You have to integrate that more into the company and into the storyline. And we all have stories like that. But those are stories that for a lot of people, they keep close down. But then you look and it's like Richard Branson, he'll come right out and say, I got so many darn learning disabilities. I struggle with this and that, but it's a gift. So many of the brilliant people that we connect with, we connect in terms of stories. And, this isn't to be political, but if I look at one other person, if we look at Donald Trump and we look at it objectively, most people aren't able to connect with him because his stories don't resonate with people like Richard Branson, who's like, look, the difference between me and many other people is not that I'm smarter than everybody else. It's just that I've failed more than everybody else. And I'm willing to keep trying and trying and trying. I've just failed more and I got learning disabilities and everything. Look, if I can do it, anybody can do it. So
There's a
it's
difference between them, and the difference is that one of those stories focuses on the audience and the person that is listening to it. The other story focuses on the person telling the story, which is
uh,
why people aren't connecting with it. They're not seeing themselves in it. There's not that connection to the person. But I did want to touch on something you said because I feel like this is so important for
please.
anyone telling a story about that feels really uncomfortable to me. That's too private. So storytelling is personal, but personal doesn't mean private. And each person decides what is private and what they don't want to share. There is, though, this natural hesitation to share something that might be viewed as a weakness, like a learning disability or, a health issue or something like that. And you have to decide what is private for you, and people respond to vulnerability. So the
Right.
reason that we respond to Richard Branson is it's like, wow, he's talking about that. That's really vulnerable. We respond to that. And so it's a little bit of a mind trick of accepting there's certain things that you won't talk about, and that's completely fine. But recognizing you might want to push that bar a little bit further than you think because people will respond to the humanity piece of it.
How important is vulnerability to the recipe of creating a powerful story?
It's huge, but I'm gonna give you the magic question, the magic sentence for people to ask themselves that helps you release it. And the question that releases you from all of that is, who am I okay disappointing? Because once you get really clear on that, and I'm delivering the message that I think is right for them, I can let go of all of that other stuff, and that diminishes some of that vulnerability because I'm targeting a specific audience. And so anytime you're starting to hear that noise, or what if it's imposter syndrome or whatever that is for you, ask yourself that, because it is really grounding and lets you let go and recognize a lot of those things that feel like vulnerability are audiences you don't care about.
Over the years, I found that, when you're younger, you think that you're the only one with a challenge. For me, it was learning disabilities. I didn't want to tell anybody when I was younger because I thought that, I was the only one with a challenge or a problem like that. But when you're looking at creating influence at a larger scale, I've found that if you are willing, like you said, to be vulnerable and almost treat them to some degree as a friend. You let them on the inside of who you are,
Yeah.
which is, look, this is the challenge that I went through. Here's the ways that I've overcome it and used it to my advantage, which is great news for you because you can do blah, 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 blah.
In my book, I interviewed different storytellers, different people that tell stories in different ways. So one of them is this physician. His name is Dr. Anthony Williams, and he is with the University of Minnesota Medical School. So they have storytelling as part of their medical school curriculum. And one
Oh,
of the things they have is what they call a story slam. So a story slam is where different people submit stories. They almost make it like a little competition where you get up and you vote for stories. But what they're doing is they're creating community because they're all being vulnerable, talking about the patients they've struggled with, or how healthcare workers have been treated during the pandemic, or, unfortunately, doctors have an incredibly high rate of depression, suicide, all of these things. And what they're doing is combating all of that because now in a room full of 200 people, I realize I'm not the only one that's having these thoughts, these feelings, these experiences. And oh my gosh, that feels so much better. And it also makes them better able to care for patients. And so there's so many layers to what can happen. To use your Richard Branson example, we're responding to him as a human because he's not trying to put layers or airs on. He's making you feel like he's a friend talking about it, but it can
Yeah.
also create this place that helps lessen some of the burdens that we carry.
So, for our listeners who might be wondering, why is Charlie talking about stories when this is really the Beyond Seven Figures podcast? So, the Harvard Business Review wrote an article, I believe it was in the May issue, and they said they were highlighting the importance of creating a personal brand. And so, when you think about creating that personal brand, how do you create a personal brand that actually is sticky, where people remember who you are, that people want to be connected with you and do business with you and whatnot? And what are some of the challenges with those that have failed to do it in the right way? What is your take on the importance of establishing a founder's brand? And what advice do you have for founders in creating a powerful brand that's going to resonate with their ideal audience?
Yeah. Well, first, the art of using story isn't a soft thing. It is key if you are growing your business and connecting with people. And there's a whole bunch of science that we can get into in that. And some of that translates into brand and how people experience you. What I hear a lot of with brand is people are searching for their origin story so that people understand who I am and who we are and why we're doing what we do and make it really compelling. And maybe I never had this like moment that it all came together. And that is just so unhelpful because you don't need an origin story. People aren't buying from you because of why you started, they're buying because of the problems that you are solving now. And people aren't buying your product or your service, they're buying the aspiration. As one of my friends says, you have to punch them in the bruise, meaning we all have these insecurities and problems and challenges and things that nag us that we haven't addressed. And when you can start to tell stories that hit to that, it's so important.
And is
So
it a
there's not one overarching story that's going to hit all of that. And that's okay because it's going to be too diluted if you
sure.
do. It's the smaller stories that connect in different moments that are going to reinforce who you are and the pain points that you're solving or the aspirations you're helping your client or customer base achieve.
And when you're telling that story about Punch You in the Bruise, that founder story, does how important is it for the founder to say, because I've been bruised too? So
It's
basically,
not
I
so important.
understand where you're
Yeah.
coming from,
So it's
how
less
important.
important that they say it and more important that they show it. Because why you started something isn't why you're doing it now. Focus on why you started something and more important to focus on why are you doing it now? What do you hope to achieve? What are some of those things that you've seen work? Like that is where people are going to see themselves in it and then connect with it more strongly.
So what's your favorite business brand in your mind right now? Which company has done one of the best jobs that immediately stands out for you?
So there's this company called Eterniva. And they take remains from your loved ones. If you have a loved one cremated, it could be an animal or a family member or friend, and they can turn that into jewelry. And they
Hmm.
take you through the process of how do they put it into the thing and carbon pressure and they like show this whole journey of they'll share a little story about the loved one and how they start the process and what they send to the family every step of the way. And so you get to see this beautiful journey from what is a really tragic, hard, difficult moment in many people's lives, and then how they get this gift to take going forward. I think that's such smart storytelling because you're going to be aware of it because of what they take you through. And then you see the respect they carry in the process. I just think that's really interesting in a world I knew nothing about that now I'm like, let's see the carbon unveiling. What did they get? So it to me, it's when people show the work and they show you things like that, that it's really interesting. And so to me, it's often those that tell the smallest stories that you connect with, because then you realize, oh my gosh, if they do this for one, imagine what they do at scale. So
Mhm.
those are the ones that I'm always paying attention to and am intrigued by.
So, how do you recommend crafting a powerful story? What is the recipe for that?
The first is really start with your audience. We love to have our favorite playlist of stories that we tell, but those aren't necessarily the stories that our audience needs to hear. And so, anytime you're going to tell a story or even give a communication, you want to be thinking about, who am I telling this to? And there's four questions you can ask yourself to get grounded. First is, what do I want them to know or do after? What do I
Mhm.
want them to think or feel? Where are they at currently, and what might be an obstacle in shifting their thinking? Because you need that clarity to know who you're talking to and feeling like you're sitting across the table from them. You also want to be thinking about, where are they today, so you can pick them up where they are and move them to where you want to get them to and navigate those outcomes. So when you see stories that don't work, it's most often because they've neglected the audience altogether and they're focusing on what they want to tell versus what the audience needs to hear. Because then you're starting now to connect to the idea that you have to the audience that you want to tell. And there are endless ideas of stories. I always encourage people, start your list before you ever need to tell a story.
Yeah.
Think of what your clients and customers tell you, what people talk about online, the questions you get most often, your own experiences with stuff, and make a list of potential stories before you ever need to tell one, because it's harder to come up with an idea when you're backed up against a deadline. But when you have this toolkit, you get to scan it, and the very act of scanning it often prompts a new idea that's absolutely perfect for your audience.
So, I'm sure you operate on a number of different frameworks, but what would one of your favorite frameworks look like?
I use the same one, but it has flexibility so you can use it different ways. So I like to use a simple four-part structure, which is, what is the context for the story? And you write out a sentence. And the context is, what's the setting? Like, who's involved? Why should the audience even care? Write a sentence out for, what is the conflict in this story? What is the outcome? What is the result of the conflict? What action is taken and what happens? And then the fourth one, which is often skipped but shouldn't be, is, what is the takeaway? If you were going to write this theme or this overall takeaway for the story, what is it? So now you've got the sentence for, what is the context of the story? What is the conflict to be resolved? What is the outcome of what happens? And what is the takeaway? And it's giving you a basic structure for a story. Doing this helps you start to organize your story and almost think of it as how different pieces that you can use to tell it. You don't have to tell it in that format, but it's giving you the basic pieces, because what you want to do with that structure is go back to what you defined for your audience of what you want them to know, think, feel, or do, and look at your takeaway of the story and make sure, can I connect these? Is this story doing what
Mm.
I need it to do? And once you get that, then you get to build out the story and add the details and play with what's the right order and how do I add more tension here, do something there. And it allows much more flexibility than just following a basic structure like the hero's journey.
Sure. I know that even in my business, sometimes the story actually has nothing to do with me or nothing even to do with an actual event, but we're trying to tell a story to create a point. So, in many cases, it's not even just about what has happened in your life or what has happened in the client's life. It's, what is the story that we can tell that could be factually true, and you don't pretend that it's factually true, but it's a metaphoric story just to be able to prove a point. And those can sometimes be equally as powerful.
I argue they're sometimes more powerful. And I would always encourage, like, try to tell true stories. Telling a story of someone else's experience doesn't dilute what you're trying to do. The difference when you're telling someone else's story or something not related to the topic at all is that it often lowers defensiveness. So I do a lot of work with C-suite teams, and they will be having conflict and problems with trust. And so there was one in particular that had a really hundreds of millions of dollars in quality issues. And they were just constantly fighting and not wanting to unpack what was happening. They wanted to dig into operations when it was really a team dynamic issue. And I told the story of NASA, which has been very public with their challenges as the Columbia Challenger and Apollo
Yeah.
disasters left astronauts killed. And so I told this story talking about what NASA did and how, of course, they did not want anyone to die, but because of challenges in trust and communication, there were these problems. And what happened is I told that story is defensiveness came down because it's no longer this is our inadequacy leading to this $100 million quality issue. This is something that others struggle with, and it's okay for us to unpack this and look at it. And that's not what my takeaway was. That's not even my message. My message to them wasn't, it's okay for you to have these issues. I was just telling that story, but that's what happened. When you tell what I call a parallel story, which is it's going to align to the takeaway that you want your audience to have, but it is a different context, it's easier for them to place themselves in it because this is not their reality. Your ideas for stories do not have to be from yourself, your business, your own experiences. Sometimes hearing a story about someone else or some other situation can be equally as powerful.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up. When I was in college, so many moons ago, we read this book called The Goal. And even still, my wife will joke around and will say, "Oh, that's the Herbie," or "Don't be a Herbie," or, because Herbie was the bottleneck in the assembly line. But it just makes it so easy because it's like, as soon as we bring up Herbie, we know exactly what's going on. And with my team, we read a book recently, and it was the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And when we were talking after reading it, we were like, I can see how sometimes we might be this person by name, or sometimes we might be this person.
Yep.
And it was so much easier to connect it with a label like, oh, we could be this person or that person, because instantly we know exactly what all of that meant.
Right. It gives you a vocabulary and it makes it easier to talk about without it feeling like, how dare you say I do that? You're like, oh, yeah, you're
Right.
right. I do act like that sometimes. Okay, that's helpful. Or you watch it, yeah, it's so helpful. Like
And
so much of storytelling is where we started. It's creating these little shifts in energy so that it's creating an openness to think different or try different or do
yeah.
something different.
And also let the person know, when you said take their defense down, it lets them know that I'm not the only one going through this, that other people have done this. And now, if other people have done it, then it's safe for me to admit that I've gone through this too.
Yeah.
And on the contrary, that I was just at an event over the past weekend. The storyline was all about, like, look at, what we've been able to do beginning from, point X to point Y. And it was this story of inspiration. So it was constantly inspiring and motivating. I think one of the best storytellers is Tony Robbins, where he's always using story and he gets people completely zoned in. And then before you know it, you're sitting there wiping your eyes and it's like, oh my gosh. And it's inspiring change.
But that's
It's
the point, right? It's all aspirational. And that's what he's doing really well versus here's this program to whatever, solve these things. He connects them
right.
immediately to that aspiration, which to me, the best brand stories do.
Sure. I love this conversation because your traditional marketer or traditional salesperson would think in terms of, I'm going to tell you to do this and tell you all the reasons why you should do this, and you should just do it. And
Yeah.
then they
And no one wants to be
struggle.
told what to do. You
Right.
tell a
And
story and I get to choose what I want to do because I'm seeing myself in it. And then it feels like a choice.
that's the difference between your traditional marketing copy that is like, here's all the features, here's all the benefits, you should do this. And then you've got Steve Jobs who stands up in front of the audience and goes, this is a dumb phone. And then this is a smartphone. And he tells a story. And then
Mhm.
before long, all of a sudden, people are lining the streets, sleeping on the streets to get their hands on a phone that is the most expensive phone that the world has seen, and ever, I believe. And then they walk right in, they throw their credit card down without expecting to negotiate on price. They don't read the sales copy. They don't ask how many megapixels of storage. And what they did is they said, I love the story so much. Take my credit card. I want to be part of that story.
And some of what makes it so powerful is it was simple. It is simple. They still follow the same model, right?
Mm,
Simplicity takes a story a really long way because
Yeah.
it gives space for people to fill in the other pieces.
So I know we're pushing up against the clock and I want to be fair to your time. So this is the Beyond Seven Figures podcast. What would you say would be your biggest, best tip for the CEOs and leaders listening who want to take their businesses beyond seven figures?
Not going to surprise anyone. I'm going to encourage you to embrace storytelling because it's not only going to strengthen your business, the people that work with you, it's going to make your customers and clients be more excited about the solutions you provide for them and get involved. And it's a compounding skill. Once you start telling stories, you get to tell more and more of them, and they flow much easier and it's much more enjoyable. You work less hard when you're communicating with a story than when you're trying to sell a bunch of details.
I love it. And if people want to learn more about you and how to write a story, where do we send them?
Yeah, my website is the best place. It's my name, KARENEBER.com. On there, you can see more about my book, The Perfect Story. You can check out blog resources that have tons of tips on storytelling and follow all of my social.
Karen, this has been awesome. So I just want to thank you again for everybody listening. Go to Karen Eber, KARENEBER.com. Grab a copy of her book. Write stories. Do yourself a favor. Take action. Write yourself a story. And then when you're done with that, write yourself another story and continue writing stories. Karen,
Absolutely.
thank you so much for being a guest here at the Beyond Seven Figures podcast. Just as a reminder for our guests, for more tips, strategies, and information to take your company beyond seven figures. Also, check us out at predictableprofits.com. Again, that's predictableprofits.com. This is Charles Gadet with my new friend, Karen Eber, and I will see you in another episode.